Hello, everyone. Welcome to our webinar today, where we are going to be discussing a new report that is really starting to shake up thinking about what's wrong with utility rates in California. Why are they so high, or why are they climbing? What role does rooftop energy play in that? And why has the debate gotten so off track? And we're having this discussion at a time when we have dramatic changes in the energy landscape that make us understand, or should make us understand, that California's leadership is more important than ever. And if California is not leading in the right direction, not leading with the conviction that the public should be served by these utilities first and foremost, then we are in trouble indeed, in addition to all the stress that's coming from Washington for energy dominance, drill, baby drill, and all the rest. So this is a report that's especially timely, and we're going to talk to authors of it, and we're also going to talk to some experts who've read it, commented on it, and have deep experience being concerned with not just the business of generating and distributing electricity in California, but also the consumer's perspective on that business. And there's lots of anger in California at these utilities now. This report may stir up more anger, but what we're really hoping is it will get us back on the track where we can have lower, reasonable rates paid by customers for the electricity that they receive from major utilities in California. The report, I just want to call attention to it, and we'll be hearing in detail. It's just come out this month. Rooftop solar reduces costs for all ratepayers. Dated February 2025. We'll be hearing again from the authors. And now I want to introduce our panelists, because this report could have had many more panelists, because a lot of people have commented on this report very favorably, as it's beginning to open people's eyes to what the real problem is with rate increases in California, what the real causes are, and how rooftop solar fits in. We have really distinguished experts here. We'll be hearing from Richard McCann, PhD with M Cubed Consulting, who's the lead analyst and author, principal investigator, I guess you would say, on this report. We'll be hearing from Brad Hevner, who is, I think, now the executive director. Do I have that right? It's
starting in 2 weeks. I'm
starting in
transitioning
2 weeks,
the
soon to be
policy
executive
director to
director.
executive. Yes.
Currently policy director of California Solar and Storage Association. Congratulations in advance. Loretta Lynch is the former president of the California Public Utility Commission, with deep experience, obviously, from that service and what she has done before and since. We'll also be hearing from one of the most effective consumer voices in Sacramento and statewide, Jamie Court, from Consumer Watchdog. So let's start off. I'm going to turn it over to Richard McCann. The way we're going to do this, we're going to hear from Richard and from Brad. They're going to talk through this report, its main findings. Then we're going to turn to our other panelists. They'll respond, and then we'll open it up to the audience. And if you would please use the Q&A function on your screen, the bottom of your screen, to type your questions. I'll read them out. Please identify yourself, if you can, by media outlet. And we're assuming that everyone understands that the main purpose of this is to inform the media. So we'll prioritize questions from media outlets. Please let us know which outlet you're with. Okay, let's start off with Richard McCann from M Cubed Consulting, and you are the central troublemaker here, I think, with your insights in this new report, Richard. So thanks for joining us.
Well, thank you. I've been consulting for about 40 years, testifying at the PUC for 30, and have worked for state agencies on big projects, including testifying at the Federal Energy Regulatory Commission on behalf of the state of California. So I've been working on these types of issues for a long period of time. And if you can put up our slide, is the slide up? Yes, there we go. There. So we have the report. It's out. It's an extended version of a short report that we issued in October on the issue of the benefits that accrue from having rooftop solar, those benefits accruing to ratepayers. But I'm going to start by talking about and describing what the current situation is with electric utilities and with loads and rates. And so if you turn to the next slide, we can see here that the dotted red line is the recorded metered peak electricity demand at the California ISO since 2002. And an interesting aspect of this is you can see in 2006 that the peak load was just over 50,000 megawatts. That's still the second highest peak load ever that's been recorded in the CAISO. There is a 2022 peak load that occurred when under very unusual circumstances, but basically we've been averaging something under 50,000 megawatts that entire time. The important part of this is that transmission and distribution costs are driven largely by the peak demand on the system, that the utilities install transmission to meet that peak demand. The distribution system is sized largely to the peak demand by customers over this time period. Yet you could see that the transmission and distribution rate components have been increasing at a fairly steady rate over the last 22 plus years. And this increase has been at over 300% for all three of the investor-owned utilities. The dotted line at the bottom is the inflation rate over that same period, which rose about 77%. So essentially rates have grown at 4 times the speed of inflation over this time period. And we're left with a bit of a mystery as to why this is happening. If these costs are actually fixed costs, as the utilities claim, they should be steady over this time because we have steady demand over the same time period. Yet they're not. So if we turn to the next slide, we can see an important relationship between rates and spending. Here we show PG&E's rates and spending over the last 10 years, since 2013. On the left, we have PG&E spending about $6 billion on transmission and distribution, or recovering, I should say, in their rates, about $6 billion, and their average rate of just under 9 cents a kilowatt hour. When we get out to 2024, we have a rate increase to 24 cents a kilowatt hour, but we also have a similar increase in the total amount of spending or revenue requirements by the utility in that same time period. The relationship between this spending and recovery of those costs is 1-to-1, virtually 1-to-1 with the rate increase. In other words, rates are rising in direct tandem with increased utility spending. Now, what's important about this is if customers were departing the utility system, that they were somehow shirking their responsibility for utility costs, the rates would be rising much faster than utility spending. There would be a divergence of that yellow dashed line going up much faster than the solid blue line. But that's not what we're seeing. We're seeing that there is a very high correlation between spending and rates, which means that it is spending, not what customers are doing, which is driving up rates in California for all these customers. And there's a similar pattern with the other two investor-owned utilities as well. So this holds across all of the customers. And as you saw in the previous slide, this pattern has actually gone all the way back to 2002 at least, and historically has actually been a problem for decades in California. So we can go to the next slide and look at what has actually been happening with resources and forecasts, and how has rooftop solar been important in controlling utility costs to the extent that it can. So we have the dotted red line, which is the forecasted demand by the Energy Commission in 2005. This is peak demand forecast over that same time period. This blue line is the same line as that dotted red line that we were looking at earlier. what's interesting is the forecast was about 15,000 megawatts higher than the average peak load over this time period that we have seen with the CAISO metered peak. What I found when I did this slide 3 years ago for a different client, I found that there was about 15,000 megawatts of new solar NEM capacity installed over that same time period, which happens to be about 15,000 megawatts of peak load. It basically, rooftop solar has displaced the peak load demand in the CAISO system and kept the CAISO load flat over that same time period. This is a result of customers jumping into the million solar rooftop campaign and spending their own money to install rooftop solar over that time period, and actually helping out the state by avoiding investment in new generation capacity, new transmission, new distribution, avoiding expensive contracts that were signed over that time period, and saving customers billions of dollars. Rates would be even higher than what they are now if rooftop solar had not been present. So we can look at the next slide and we can actually see how this is working today. This is a picture of what how the resources were deployed to meet the peak load in California on September 5th in 2024. That day it was 114 in Santa Clarita. So Los Angeles was hitting very high peak loads during that time period. What's interesting is the CAISO metered peak was 48,000 megawatts on that day. So that's very close to that 50,000 megawatts that we saw in 2006. But what's really interesting is there was another additional over 9,000 megawatts of rooftop solar generating at that same time. So, and what we're seeing is the customer site peak load is actually very close to what the CEC forecasted it would be back in 2005. In other words, the Energy Commission was correct when they forecasted what would happen with the peak load. It's just that they didn't know that rooftop solar was going to be a key component of meeting that peak load 20 years later. And so what happens is the ISO does not see this rooftop solar and is not really able to account for it in their planning or in their operations. For example, they do not have reserve margins for that solar generation. They don't install more transmission or distribution in order to deliver energy because it's being used on site. So what we are seeing is that what we expected to happen 20 years ago is actually happening. It's just that the mix of resources that we're seeing is very different than what was expected at the time. And so we have avoided utility spending over that time period. So if we turn to the next slide, you might ask, well, what about wildfire spending? Isn't that what the cause of the big increases in utility rates? What's underlying it? Well, turns out that there was a spike in wildfire spending about 3 years ago, and some small increases since then. But basically, among the three utilities, wildfire spending is only about 12 to 13% of their total revenue requirements in that time period. And what's really happened is we had a $5 billion increase in what the utilities were asking for in 2024, but very little of it was actually related to wildfire spending, maybe 20% of it. So there's something else that was included in the utility revenue requirement requests that is somewhat mysterious. I was involved in both PG&E and SDG&E's general rate cases that have contributed to these rate increases. And we were never really able to scratch beneath the surface to be able to clearly identify the justification for these big increases in revenue requirement requests by these utilities. So it's not wildfire spending that is really the key issue here. It is the increase in utility spending in general that has been happening since 2002 that is really the big problem here. So if we turn to the next slide, this is showing our analysis compared to what the Public Advocate's Office released last September. They had a report claiming that there was an $8.5 billion cost shift by these rooftop customers to all other customers. And so there's a lot of misconceptions that have happened in their analysis. The first one is that they didn't really acknowledge the legal right of these customers to self-generate, that any customer is allowed to produce their own product without having to pay a corporation the profits that the corporation wants going forward. And so these customers basically self-serve about 50% of their load. And so that reduces the cost shift by half right here, $4 billion off the top. The second thing is they made a series of errors. They used a solar output number that's too high. Even the Energy Commission uses a number that's lower than what they had asserted in their analysis. They ignored the existence of care customers who own rooftop solar as well, so that actually reduces this cost shift. And they also had an opaque way of calculating the retail rates. And when we calculated those retail rates, we found that they were significantly lower. This all knocks about $2.5 billion off of their calculations. So we're down to about $2 billion in potential cost shift. But the problem is that then they used the wrong tool to do this calculation. They used the avoided cost calculator, which is a tool that they use at the PUC to evaluate future resource additions. It does not include any historic information about what utilities avoided in those costs. And rates are made up of historic costs and savings, not of what happens in the future. So you need to use what's historic in doing this calculation. And when we went back and added in what the historic savings were, that basically eliminated the rest of the $2 billion in potential cost shifts. And then you can add in the fact that customers don't have to pay care customers for their subsidy if the care customers are self-generating. So that saved another $160 million a year. And finally, these customers also, rooftop customers pay an average of $105 a month to the utilities above and beyond what they generate for themselves. So they are contributing a significant amount to the utilities. And when you look at what they are contributing towards the fixed costs of the utilities, it works out that they're contributing about $1.2 billion towards those fixed costs. And we end up with these customers actually providing $1.5 billion in savings to other customers by using this analysis by using this approach that the Public Advocate's Office attempted to use to show a cost shift. There's problems with even the concept of how the Public Advocate's Office did this analysis, but I'm just playing in their sandbox right now, showing that even then they did it incorrectly. So then on the next slide, we show why are utilities wanting to pursue so much investment in a new transmission and distribution infrastructure that's really not needed, or it doesn't seem to be needed. And the fact is that they earn a 10% return on their investment equity for every dollar that they put into steel and concrete structures in their T&D system. And so the more T&D infrastructure there is, the bigger their profits. And we can see how these profits have risen over the last 20 years. This filing or this information is from the FERC Form 1s that are filed every year by the utilities. And you can see that they rose very steadily through 2017. And then PG&E had, of course, the fires in 2017. in which they were then eventually convicted of felony charges for the deaths that they caused. But they've rebounded nicely. They're now up to $2.5 billion again in terms of profits, back on that trend line that they were going on before. And so both Edison and San Diego Gas and Electric have also had similar profit increases over the same time period. This is really at the heart of what is going on here, that utilities earn profits by spending more money, not by serving their customers. They don't really get enhanced benefits from better service. They just get it from putting more in the ground and spending our money. And so that's really the heart of the issue, is how do we change that? So looking at the next slide, we just to sum up why California investor utilities have such high electricity rates. It's really utility spending that is driving rate increases. Programmatic and wildfire spending have a small portion of this rate increase. But it's not really the lion's share of what's going on. Customers are investing in rooftop solar and energy efficiency that is saving ratepayers money. The state loading order emphasizes using less energy. It's energy efficiency, distributed energy, then renewables, and then other utility resources. What the utilities are advocating right now will flip this on its head. In fact, they advocate buying more out of the California ISO where the natural gas generation is. And then they want to go to renewables, and then they want to go to energy efficiency and rooftop solar as a last resort. So they really have this backwards. And so the real key question for us is, how do we control utility spending, and not how do we make everyone pay for uncontrolled spending? It's really stealing from other customers to solve this problem is not going to be a sustainable solution. What are we going to do 3 years from now when we've already drained that customer swamp and our rates are still extremely high? We need a much more structured way of addressing this problem. And with that, I'm going to turn it over to Brad.
Okay, thanks, Richard. And hello, folks. Thanks for joining us. Questions go in the Q&A box in case you missed Ken's intro at the beginning, and we'll be getting to them after myself and two other speakers. But I wanted to add some comments and some perspective of having produced this report. And Brad Hebner, I'm the policy director of the California Solar and Storage Association. And I want to talk about the impact of the policy decisions that have been based on this bad cost shift theory. The cost shift story has been at the heart of all policy debates in California related to rooftop solar for the past 10 years. And that is intentional. It was devised by the utilities as a way to reframe what rooftop solar is and to put a negative light on it. And it has worked. The utilities have done a very good job of creating the story and pushing it in policymakers. That the cost shift story is the result of a sophisticated utility PR campaign, and state officials have fallen in line with this distorted utility view of the world. And part of that story is that rooftop solar adopters are by and large rich white people, and it's poorer people of color that are paying for those people that put solar panel on their roofs. This is not true. It is not a fact. And it was, you can look at the utility PR memos from 10 years ago when they created this. And they said, we need to, they felt like they were losing the debate on rooftop solar. And the utilities hired PR firms to say, you know, how do we message this? And part of the results of that was to make it an equity issue, to talk about income and race, and to frame the rooftop solar issue as one related to equity. In reality, it's not. And this data we show here is from Lawrence Berkeley National Labs, where they do the most sophisticated study anywhere of the actual income and racial makeup of solar adopters. This is on an address level, the actual household data, and it shows that 60% of solar adopters in 2023 were low and medium income, and that a majority of solar households were people of color. And this is 2023 data that's shown here. In the early days, 15 years earlier, it was slightly more skewed, but not much towards higher rates and higher incomes. It really has been a consistent case over time. Even 20 years ago, half of the solar adopters were low and medium income. And it's trending in the right direction, but it's a solid story to begin with. Next slide. Okay, and then so Richard talked about how he's basically disproving that solar is departing load. Solar is avoiding load growth, or it will reduce load growth, and that's very important because the whole cost shift theory is really built on this concept where utility costs are fixed, and when some customers pay less, other customers pay more. But the pie is not fixed. The pie has been kept from growing by rooftop solar. And then in the future, it will reduce that growth. But we are going to see unprecedented growth in California due to electric vehicles, electric heat in buildings. So this is just heat pumps and EVs in the CEC prediction of the increased electricity need by 2030. And yeah, by 2030, we're still just getting going on electrification. The numbers will be far bigger after that. But if you just look at that time period, it's a lot of new energy consumption. And if we have a very healthy amount of rooftop solar growth, we're still only offsetting a little over half of that. So there will be increased need for the utilities to build more bigger substations, poles and wires, and large scale power plants to feed those electric vehicles. If we were to rely entirely on the utilities to serve that new load, it'd be the most foolish thing we can do, because they've been overbuilding and overspending in good times. Just imagine how they'll do when growth when usage is growing. And so the more that we can offset that with local generation near where the electricity is used, that obviously takes weight off the need to expand the grid. And so the issue of departing load is nonsensical when you look at this kind of load growth. At best, we're going to offset a significant portion of the load growth. Okay, next slide. All right, and so the impact of the decisions based on the cost shift story have been big. And here we see the transition to NEM 3, or the net billing tariff, that happened early in 2023. There was a huge surge of customers submitting applications before that transition. The surge is not something we welcomed. It's disruptive. We want steady business. Any industry would like the business to be steady rather than boom and bust. And so there were a lot of customers who jumped in there, and we absolutely expected some number of months of a tightened market, of difficult times, of very little new customer activity in solar right after the transition. But it's now been a year and a half, and people are pretty stunned that we haven't seen any rebound. And we don't know when or if that's going to grow back up to a pre-surge level of solar adoption. All policy leaders in California should be focused on making sure that rooftop solar recovers and is a fundamental part of the California energy landscape. On the next slide, we show just the average installation rate of the net billing tariff, NEM 3, versus net metering previously. And on an average monthly basis, we go back 10 years. It has not been, the market has not been this low since 2014. So setting the California rooftop solar market backwards 10 years at a time when we're increasing the need to transition to clean energy and to get local power for local consumption is very bad outcome of a poorly implemented policy. Next slide. Okay, and it's had real impact on jobs in the market. We lost 17,000 jobs in the first year of NEM 3. That's more job loss than during COVID. And these are, 17,000 families, 17,000 skilled workers who are up there installing this stuff and designing solar systems day after day in communities throughout the state. It's a huge loss to California that we're losing that expertise and those people that are out there doing the work that we want them to do. And in terms of the viability of solar companies, we've seen some major bankruptcies. A lot of companies have closed their doors because they just don't see the market potential and they've gotten out of the business. Some have actually declared bankruptcy and not been able to pay their bills because the market disappeared. And then this shows just the portion of companies that are concerned about their ability to stay in business given the current market conditions. Obviously, 81% of companies won't go out of business, but the fact that 81% of companies are concerned about staying in business is really, really troubling. Okay, next slide. And then, so here's where we need to get. According to the California Energy Commission, we need 101 gigawatts of solar, both utility scale and customer-sited solar combined by 2045 to meet our goals. If we don't get the offshore wind that they expect, this will need to be higher. If other good things don't happen, this will need to be higher, but this is their expectation of the contribution that's needed from solar. And the rooftop solar is a necessary component of our clean energy growth, getting to 100% decarbonized grid. So what we need more than anything is for policymakers to embrace rooftop solar and take it as their mission to figure out how to remove barriers and facilitate the adoption for customers to put solar on the roofs. California policymakers have departed from that mindset as the result of this utility PR campaign. And it results from this analysis that I have to tell you, even I, who have been a critic of the way they've done their math for years, have learned a lot from Richard's analysis. And it's not just a matter of bad inputs and bad calculations. That's one big piece of it, as Richard just explained. But it's more than that. It's a fundamental wrong approach that they're taking, that the folks pushing the cost shift story just set about studying the solar costs and benefits in a wrong way and intentionally skewing their approach in order to skew the results. That they have been using a tool that's supposed to measure future benefits and applying it to the past. And those two things just don't add up. And the fact that they are only looking at part of a customer's bill. The cost shift analysis is just looking at the net metered kilowatt hours and comparing it to as if it were a new resource and do we want to choose that versus something else. They're not looking at how much a customer actually pays to the utility after installing solar, and does that cover the fixed costs of the grid that they continue to use. That's an important question to ask. We think that that question should be asked and adequately studied. That's not what the cost shift folks look at. They have this mini analysis of part of the solar customer's bill that's sort of built to fail in their methodology, and it produces the outcome that they're looking for. And if we do a full analysis of whether customers with solar are paying their fair share of the grid, Richard finds conclusively, yes, they are. So I'll leave it there, Ken, and we can go on and be ready for questions.
Great, Richard. Brad, thank you so much. We're not going to solve our problems at this rate. We're going to have increasing electricity costs, and we're going to fall short of our clean energy goals. That's the trajectory we're on now. That's what state officials, the Utility Commission and the legislature, and the governor's office, that's the problem this analysis lays at their feet. And I think the question really is, how do we reharness rooftop solar distributed energy to these purposes to solve both of these problems? Because without it, it doesn't seem like we're getting there. I want to call on Loretta Lynch, former president of the California Public Utility Commission, for any comments you care to make, Loretta, and then I'll ask Jamie Court from Consumer Watchdog to say a few words, and then we'll jump to the questions. And again, if you would would please in the Q&A type your questions in on the screen and we'll get to them pronto. So Loretta?
Thanks, Ken. Clearly, the big problem here is high punishing rates and customer bills. And I believe those bills, the costs that go into those bills are unwarranted. And Richard McCann's data and analysis shows that. It shows that these profligate utility costs are not inevitable. They are a result of policy choices at the PUC and at the ISO. And Richard's analysis digs deep to show, when you read his full analysis, that the primary drivers of a vast majority of the costs over the last 5 to 10 years have been extraordinary procurement at premium prices and also transmission and distribution pricing, and the tripling of the costs of transmission and distribution costs over the last decade. In part, those costs are tripled because of Order 679's premium profits that are allowed on transmission, which is allowing and causing this rush to get your transmission line built so that you can experience premium profits. And the folks who own those transmission lines are the utilities. So what do we need to do instead of pointing fingers and pointing blame mistakenly? We need to audit the prior utility costs and not throw more money at them until they can show us how and even whether they spent the money the PUC has already thrown at them. And we need to reduce the utilities' profits to the national average, or perhaps tie those profits to increases in safety. Because while California is in the top quartile for profits, we are in the bottom quartile among the states for safety. As long as our policymakers focus on the wrong problem, we won't find the right solution to reducing customers punishing and unwarranted bills. And Richard McCann's analysis really points us in the right direction. Thanks, Ken.
Thanks so much, Loretta. Jamie, what are you taking away, and what should consumers take away from this analysis, Jamie Court?
Well, consumers know they're getting screwed. They're paying the highest rates in the country. And I think the analysis sheds a lot of light on why. This is an establishment, a utility establishment that has been dominating for a long time, going back to deregulation in the 90s. We've been paying for that deregulation for the last 30 years on our bills. These stranded assets, and in 1996, our group actually filed a ballot measure to prevent the stranded assets from nuclear facilities being putting on the bill, but it was stopped by the utilities. So we have this unfortunate situation where the utilities have been dominating this debate, and their workers' unions, the IBEW, right along with them, dominating this debate. And the workers' unions don't like rooftop solar because they want to build these big solar arrays where they have union jobs, which are much more expensive. We all know that rooftop solar is much more effective, cost effective. In fact, the utilities years ago were talking about the death spiral they're going to be in if everybody got into rooftop solar. And now we have, unfortunately, this situation where PG&E in particular, but the other utilities as well, have been using their influence to scapegoat rooftop solar. And I think this data outs them, and it demands a response from the powers that be. It demands a response from the ratepayer advocate. It demands a response from the governor. It demands a response from the PUC. We now have a moment in Sacramento where everyone is talking about affordable electricity. And the question is, will they have the guts to do what's right? And we know what's right. We know that we have to limit the rate of return that utilities make, because if they're making 10% on everything they build and everything they spend, they're going to want to build and spend more. We've got to rein them in. We've got to do the audits. And it's going to have to come from the legislature, because the Public Utility Commission, unfortunately, has been a organ of the utilities, and a lot of it goes to the revolving door. We have Carla Peterman going from becoming a commissioner to becoming a VP at PG&E. I guarantee you, there are a lot of people from the Newsom administration getting ready for their jobs at PG&E, and they are not going to bite the hand that feeds them. But if the legislature forces the question, they just might. And I believe that the Senate Pro Tem and the Speaker are serious about reform. We have a good bill that is a fairly ambitious bill by Senator Wahab, SB 332, that's right on the right track. capping utility rate increases to the cost of living, requiring annual audits, proposing executive compensation be contingent on safety. There's a lot more we can do. There's a lot in the works. There's talk about taking away, creating public bonds for transmission, so we're not paying in as shareholders to float those bonds. There's a lot in the legislature, but it starts with a recognition that the utilities have been dominating this debate. And in this case, they're wrong, and they need to answer for these numbers. They need to answer this to this data, and we need to have an honest debate if we're going to get anywhere. Thanks.
Thanks, Jamie. I'm going to open it up to questions now. We actually have three from Jeff St. John from Canary Media, and Jeff, I'm going to condense them a little bit. One of your threads here is who's hearing about this report and the data being presented? Is it going to be part of legislative hearings? Has it been presented to the Public Utility Commission? And has the Utility Commission in any way built it into ongoing proceedings or reacted to it in some way? I think that's the spirit of that question, Jeff. So I guess I'll put it to maybe to Brad and Richard. We know this report's having an impact because people are talking about it, and we know it's shaking up assumptions that have had a grip on energy policy, as several speakers have mentioned for the past 4 or 5 years. But what's happening now with presentation of this data? What are the reactions in the legislature and the Utility Commission?
Yeah, sure. Thanks. So we have done 30 or 40, probably 40 briefings on this data with legislators, media, other opinion leaders throughout California, one-on-one briefings. And we have just, the step we're taking here is we compiled it into a written report to make it all spelled out, not just PowerPoint, and making it available to everyone. So that's kind of taking it to a different level. But the individual briefings we've had have been very well received. I've actually been pleasantly surprised. We often schedule half an hour with a legislator, and we're still sitting with them 2 hours later, and they're taking notes and asking really good questions. So I feel like it has turned heads. We're all sort of realizing we do need to start looking at this a whole different way, and hopefully that will have an impact on decision-making processes. So we also submitted it to the state affordability hearing last week. So that was the first time we put this report out there, but today's the actual sort of release to the world, and we'll go on from there.
So we'll keep Jeff posted on that. Then he had an additional question.
Well, Ken, let me just follow
go
up
ahead, Richard. Sorry.
real quickly, is that the original Public Advocate's Office report was not issued in any proceeding and has never been actually subjected to any kind of regulatory oversight or review or any adversarial hearing process. So we were just responding in public to something that was publicly released. And there's been references by the governor's office and the PUC to this report issued by the Public Advocate's Office. But the report, we're the only ones who have actually vetted the report. And so there has not been a platform where we can actually debate this issue in a regulated way. So I think that's kind of enhances the fact that this has all been out as public media debate, not in front of any regulatory agency yet.
And I would add that I think we need to challenge the Ratepayers Advocate's Office to come before the Senate and answer Richard. I think we need a oversight hearing to deal with this in the Senate to get these numbers straight, because that Ratepayers Advocate Office unfortunately got it wrong, and a lot of people look to them for validation. And even before the report, the Ratepayers Advocate Office was kind of on the same cost shift strategy. And we know that the ratepayer advocate before this report was issued was Matt Baker, who became a PUC commissioner. And a way to become a PUC commissioner is doing something the utilities want, which is bagging on rooftop solar. I think there's a lot of corruption here. And I think the Senate has to have a hearing to get to the bottom of these numbers so we can set this case straight once and for all.
And I would note that Richard has a good idea, which is before the PUC goes and touts an unvetted report of dubious calculation and worth, perhaps it should put that report in an evidentiary hearing in a proceeding along with Richard's analysis and have the expert analysts go toe to toe under oath with questions and cross-examination so we can see the assumptions made, the data used, and whether or not the conclusions are valid. But before the PUC does that, they should not be wrapping themselves in the cloak of a results-oriented report.
Well, Jeff, I think that answers those questions, and it goes to the third one. We're seeing new ideas, I think fresh ideas generated here for what the impact of this report might be and how it might be delivered to policymakers. But you had an additional question, and Jamie, you spoke to this a little bit. What bills are in the works in California in this session to take on any of or a combination of these actual drivers of outsized utility costs that are being passed through to higher rates? What policies have been laid out that could be taken up by lawmakers? Do we have some proposals out there that to tame this, and some champions who are stepping up to do it?
Well, I know SB 3332 by Wahab is, as Loretta says, an ambitious proposal. She might know of other proposals out there, which means it's going to face some opposition, but it is a hell of a starting place. I do know there are people talking about creating a public transmission program so that the bonds that would fund the transmission would be public bonds, which means we wouldn't be paying 10% to the utilities for the transmission, for all their transmission lines. And I do know that there is a movement afoot to consider a ballot measure to go after the utilities. It's in its incipient phase, but if the legislature doesn't deal with this, I'm pretty certain that in 2 years we're going to have a ballot measure to deal with it, because it goes to the heart of affordability and also goes to the heart of our fossil fuel consumption. We are, we need to get off fossil fuels, and solar is a key part of that. Solar needs to be part of any equation, and the reality is the renewable portfolio standard is going to be under threat from President Trump, and it's going to be under threat from President Trump even more if we go to do a Western grid so-called pathways program that the utility workers union and some of the utilities are now pushing. We need to protect the state's right to not pay for fossil fuel, to go to rooftop solar. And I think Trump should be a wake-up call to Governor Newsom, because all of his programs are in danger. The one that he can control is rooftop solar. He can double down on rooftop solar and he can get something done, or he could fight the Trump administration, whoever comes after the Trump administration, on his renewable portfolio standard. And I bet you he's not going to win. So.
A couple other thoughts on legislation. First, Senator Josh Becker announced at the hearing last week that he is overseeing the package of bills or policies on affordability. So this is, legislative action is needed, right? We need to get the legislature to tell the PUC to be stricter against utilities and to reform the process. And I think that they're going to have some very good ideas. I don't have insight into what's going to be in that bill, but they are working on something. The existing utility spending approval process is just rotten. The utilities are able to drive the analysis of saying, here's how much we need to build. And no one else fundamentally challenges the core of their analysis. And there's minimal auditing and there's minimal accounting of how they're actually spending their money. So the two reforms I think that are most needed is just more detailed spending reports by the utilities. What are they exactly spending money on? Right now, they get approved for a lump sum, and they don't even do line item reporting of what they're spending the money on. So more detailed reporting of their spending and mandatory auditing of those spending accounts is number one. And number two, they build things seemingly based on their need to spend money and drive their profits. And they shouldn't be collecting from us, the ratepayers, the money to build those projects until we're actually using the infrastructure. If they're building stuff that's not really needed, that's the shareholder risk. Don't make us pay for things before they're needed. And there's an easy way to regulate that and say, you don't get rate recovery until the assets are used and useful.
It's a fundamental failure of regulation, but it's also a fundamental failure of political will to require the regulators to do their job as written in the law. There are plenty of statutes that require the regulators to minimize utility costs that are just not followed, frankly. But one other jump ball in this whole process about what's going to happen vis-a-vis rooftop solar is that the California Supreme Court has taken an appeal of 3 environmental groups, including the Environmental Working Group, because those 3 groups slogged through the hard process of the PUC's proceeding in order to have standing to appeal the PUC's decision, which essentially killed rooftop solar in part. And so the California Supreme Court will hear that case at least by this summer, if not before, which means we will have a decision in 2025 whether the PUC followed the law.
Yeah, I just want to point out that there's both Loretta and Brad brought this up, but there are elements within the law and regulation where California has had big gaps in their regulatory process. And it goes back to how we implemented 2 policies called decoupling and multi-year rate plans, that in a way that what we did is we handed the utilities a bunch of carrots. We tried to give them a bunch of carrots to get them to do the right thing, but we never brought in the sticks in order to make them actually adhere to what they should have been adhering to in implementing those policies. And those are the things that need to be fixed in our regulatory process in order to bring utility spending back in line.
Great points all. And I think we can all attest to the experience we've had as Californians. People are angry about these rate increases. They don't understand how this can continue. They don't understand who's standing up for them before the Public Utility Commission or in Sacramento. They're wanting leadership, and I think that's been building over the past few years, and it's going to get white hot before it's over. I think it's going to be that's why it might be time for a ballot measure. Who knows? I'm looking now to see if we have other questions in the queue. I'm not seeing any. If you have a question, please type it in the Q&A section on the bottom of your screen. And would anyone else like to make a comment about any of the topics we've covered, any of my panelists that the conversation has moved on? Do you want anything you want to go back to? And then we'll wait and see if we get another question.
I would note, Ken, that you are right on that people are angry because people aren't stupid. They see their bills really doubling over the last couple of years. Understand that the PUC allowed PG&E 5 rate increases just last year, and that was on top of several rate increases in 22 and 23. It's just unprecedented, unwarranted, and extraordinary. So people aren't stupid. They see their bills going up while their reliability and their safety goes way down because of continued utility negligence. So they are demanding a change because this is a drag. Unwarranted high utility bills are a drag on California's economy.
No question.
If I could return, if there are no further questions, there are a couple of topics more on the technical details of the faults in the utility cost shift analysis. If people are still here and want to have that sort of thing that we kind of touched on but didn't cover, that I think are just really important to understanding why they have it so wrong. Number one is that NEM credits are not a cost to the utilities. A lot of people compare the value of NEM credits and call it customer compensation and say utility procurement is something different than that. NEM is not utility procurement. It was never designed as a procurement mechanism. It is a way to reduce a customer's purchases from the utilities. NEM is a credit mechanism that treats all rooftop solar generation as reduced sales from the utilities. It's not a purchase of energy from the customer, from the utility to the customer. And so it's just wrong to call it compensation. It's wrong to say it's nowhere in the utility cost accounting. Their costs don't have anything that says here's NEM credits. It's just reduced sales. So it's a really important concept. The other one, and I mentioned this, is treating previous installations as if they're new and then evaluating them according to today's circumstances. And it takes a minute to really get at why this is the wrong approach. But the thing is that we've installed 2 million solar roofs, and there's been a lot of utility scale solar development in the past 10, 15 years. That has moved the picture on what's most valuable, when is energy most needed. Things are different now than they were before all that solar was introduced. We need the most valuable times a day for new energy sources are different than where they were 10 years ago. That difference is because of the solar that has been installed. So to treat all the past installations as if they hadn't already moved the whole picture and plugging them into the current point of the picture is just fundamentally flawed. You can't treat old resources as a new resource because those old resources changed the picture and can't be evaluated after the picture as if they weren't installed. So I hope people understand that, because it really undermines the whole basis of the cost shift theory.
Right. And just following up on Brad's point, there's claims, oh, you add new rooftop solar and it's not meeting our peak load needs because our metered peak is at 6 or 7 or 8 o'clock at night. No, that's not the point. The fact is that the customer peak load, the peak load that customers are actually using of electricity is still at 3 o'clock in the afternoon when solar output is near its maximum amount. So when we add solar, we're meeting customer peak loads, not the CAISO system metered peak or the net metered peak or whatever number that they're using. The CAISO is looking at this from their own perspective, not from the perspective of customers. And when you look at it from the perspective of customers, rooftop solar is serving their peak needs.
Excellent points. But can I just throw another point out there? As a fairly new owner of a rooftop solar system, and I'm generating power right now as I look at my app, I know that there are now efforts underway by the utilities to claw back from existing solar owners like myself, who got in before NEM 3.0, to claw back or somehow recover some of the benefits that we signed up for, thought we were going to have for the duration of our homes, longevity, the solar panels, and maybe even when we sold our home, that would add to the value of it going forward. But there are efforts now to even harm rooftop solar retroactively even more. Can some of you speak to that initiative that's underway?
Yeah, and it's really disappointing to see this coming from state officials, because the CPUC has consistently over the years rejected proposals to change the NEM terms and reduce the 20-year term of the NEM contract when those proposals were made by other people. And now they've reversed themselves. They're saying, yes, let's change those terms, and the proposal is coming from them. It's extremely disappointing. And it comes without purpose, because what Richard's analysis shows is that these customers have provided value and continue to provide value in shaving the true peak electricity usage, which is what drives costs. So could you go in there and force them to pay more money? Of course you could. You could make any one segment pay more money and bring down the amount anyone else pays. But you could, and you can imagine going after anybody. And there's no reason to go after these customers who did a good thing. And it just results in people paying more in order to fund runaway utility spending. So if utility overspending is the problem, why punish people who did a good thing?
Yeah. And it's certainly going to discourage people going forward if they, it's already discouraging enough in the NEM 3.0 era in terms of the economics, as your chart showed. But if people come to believe that any agreement they had that they thought was going to be good for, say, 20 years, means nothing to the state and to the utility regulators, if it can be wiped away, that's going to make it even harder to convince people to think that their own investments in rooftop solar are going to
It, it
pencil out.
it goes beyond just rooftop solar. It goes to electric vehicles. It goes to heat pumps. It goes to any of the other measures that we're talking about,
Yeah.
where customers might be getting incentives from the state or promises, long-term promises that they're going to do something. And then if the rug is pulled out from under people who had rooftop solar with 20-year promises, then they're going to go, why will I decide to invest in these other high cost technologies that have big upfront costs, but you need those kinds of supports in order to be able to realize the savings over time. And
Yeah.
so it's very counterproductive to even put this on the table and even discuss it is probably going to discourage customers from thinking about making those kinds of investments. And that's going to undermine our trying to get to our climate change goals in the state. It's very unfortunate.
And we have a long way to go to hit those goals. We have a couple more questions. Laura Painter from ABC 10 evening anchor. She's the evening anchor in Sacramento. Is there anything consumers can do to be a so-called stick to the utilities and the Public Utility Commission? What can people who read about this report, learn about it in the media, what can they do?
They can call their legislator and they can call the governor and say, stop the war on solar and reduce my bills by stopping utility or the profligate utility spending and profits. I mean, ultimately, this is going to take political action, policy action from our elected officials.
Anyone else on that one?
I would just second that. I mean, people should be upset about high bills and about the fact that the utilities are running away with their money, right? It's money from our pockets that the utilities are feeding to Wall Street, and state officials should not allow utilities to run roughshod over California consumers.
They can also go to PUC hearings, which happen. Is it biweekly, Loretta? I can't remember. That, anyways, gather a bunch of your friends and other people, and especially if you're in Sacramento, it's only an hour and a half. Take the train down to Sacramento and storm the hearing room at the PUC and make your voice heard in that room during the hearing. That's probably one. The commissioners do respond to political pressure when it's really brought on. I'm sure Loretta knows about that, having had to preside through the 2001 debacle, unfortunately. So that's kind of the situation is that you can make your voice heard. You just need to stand up and make it heard in such a way that they know that you're pressuring them.
You really want to scare your legislator, all you got to do is go online and see if they got any money from Pacific Gas and Electric or Edison or San Diego Gas and Electric. And
Or the
invariably, they
IBEW.
will have done it. They will have gotten campaign contributions. And then you write them saying, why did you get a campaign contribution from this person? And are you going to take a position against them? No one's talking about the money in Sacramento, because when you talk about money in Sacramento, they often lock you out of the room. But I'd venture a guess that 80% of the legislators have gotten money from PG&E, Edison, or Southern California Gas and Electric, or their parent companies. I would bet 80% have taken a check from them. And when we turn California against fossil fuels and stop community drilling, which we did, there's no more permits for drilling within a half mile of a home or a community. There's no fracking in California. And what really created that moment was when we had a no oil money pledge that legislators signed in Sacramento. Gavin Newsom signed it, which freed him up to go after the oil companies. If Gavin Newsom didn't take money from PG&E, we'd have the most reformed system and the most affordable rates. He takes a lot of money from PG&E. They all do. So the first thing we need to do to fix this is to get a no utility money pledge. That will change everything. That will change everything.
Yeah, I want to say one other thing too, is for customers to actually vote in the primaries that are leading up to the election, because very often the districts in California are single party districts. They're either Democrat or Republican. If you want action, you need to vote in the primary where there's a real contest between candidates, and pressure the candidates there to sign on to significant utility reform, and support those candidates.
Great points, Laura. I hope that gave you some ideas for sticks, and hope we can make it clear to all of the consumers out there that this is an area of your pocketbook where prices are set by politicians and the people that they hire at the Public Utility Commission, the bureaucrats, to do this work distinctively. So that's who's raising your prices ultimately, is the people who are okaying all these rate increases and are failing to look more deeply at the basis for their increase. I have another question from Jeff St. John from Canary Media. Where do we see honest acknowledgement that load growth and electrification will require greater capital expenditures than ratepayers can bear, and that IOUs, these utilities, must engage with distributed solar, load flexibility, and other cost reduction tools to protect themselves from not being caught, not being able to build enough grid to match electrification trends, or driving rates far higher than is politically feasible or palatable? Anyone want to take a crack at that?
It's a very good question. And one thing that really stands out to me is that the PUC commissioned a report a couple of years ago to ask this question. Given all the growth in EVs, are we going to break the grid? And the answer was yes, that if we rely on the utilities to deliver all that power, it's going to cost $50 billion to build out in the short term in the distribution system. And even if we didn't care about that much money, they probably couldn't build it fast enough. So it will be a choke point in meeting our electrification goals if we're relying entirely on the utilities. Sadly, the PUC has not really acted much on that report, and they didn't push it very much. That report has not gotten the attention that it deserves. So we need to have further investigation of this, and alternatives to utility build out are clear, that we can build more local generation near where it's used and come up with programs that make sure that the time that it's discharged from the customer batteries matches up with the time that their neighbors are charging their electric vehicles. We know how to do those programs. We've proven that they work. We need to grow them big.
Yeah, well, I would point out that there are two other things, which is that that study showed 50 billion. The California ISO just came out with a study that says it's going to be $63 billion to build out to meet the renewable generation additions in their transmission plan. But what's more striking is after that report was submitted, the consultants who did that report were expecting that they were going to be involved in the distribution planning rulemaking that was going on at the Public Utilities Commission. The commission then told the consultants, no, we're going to hand it over to the utilities to do this without any consultant input. It's putting the fox in the hen house in that case. And so, of course, we're not going to get actually an honest assessment of how much it's really going to cost us in order to pursue that strategy. So we're having problems here of who's watching the ball, and whether we can get a true honest assessment of what the costs are going to be and what are the cost-effective alternatives. It's a good example is actually about wildfire mitigation. There have been many other solutions offered for doing it cost effectively with the same risk level, yet nobody wants to hear about it. And so this is a continuing problem. We just are not really paying close attention to how we need to control what the utilities are doing.
But also, both of those reports have blinders on because they do not look at behind the meter resources as a solution whatsoever. They only look at, they have one hammer, here's a nail. So the ISO assumes we're going to be building long line transmission lines throughout the West, courtesy of the California ratepayer. The PUC assumes all sorts of build outs that don't involve distributed generation. Jeff's question is absolutely right. As long as we allow our policymakers at the ISO as well as at the PUC to not even look at a huge segment of the solution to the problems. Distributed energy resources, locally owned, microgrids, eliminate the over the fence rule, and behind the meter solar plus storage. We are not going to reach our climate goals, and we are going to break the bank of the ratepayers' backs if we just allow them to keep their blinders on. Time for the blinders off, time for maximum cost reduction, which may well be what Jamie was talking about. We already pay for it. Why don't we own it? And then we won't have to pay a profit or even the taxes on that profit that we pay now.
Great comments, all. I'm gonna I think we're at time now, so I'm gonna thank everyone for joining. Thank my panelists for this great work. I think you're going to hear more about this report, more about its findings, the questions it raises going forward. We're certainly going to be paying a lot of attention to it at EWG, and I'm grateful for the expertise and the passion on this call. And thank everyone for joining us. Look forward to staying up on this topic going forward. Thanks, everyone.